A simple janitor steps into a world of wealth and power when an unexpected invitation from a rich widow turns the office upside down. But why would a woman of such influence want a private meeting with him? What happens behind those closed doors will leave everyone speechless. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Malcolm Carter had never been in the executive wing before. He'd spent years cleaning the lower levels, wiping coffee stains off break room counters and mopping up the footprints of people who barely noticed him. But today was different. Today, every eye in the building was on him. He could feel it. The stares, the hushed whispers that trailed behind him like shadows. His uniform, the same gray jumpsuit he wore every day, felt heavier under their scrutiny. He kept his head down, gripping the strap of his cleaning caddy like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Is he going up there?" someone whispered as he walked past the reception desk. "I heard Mrs. Hollis personally requested him," another voice murmured, disbelief laced in every syllable. Mrs. Regina Hollis, the widow of the late Charles Hollis, the man who built this empire from the ground up. She was a legend, a woman who had turned mourning into a multi-million-dollar expansion plan. She was feared, respected, and most of all, untouchable. And yet, for some reason, she had summoned him. The elevator doors slid open, and Malcolm hesitated before stepping in. His reflection stared back at him in the gold-trimmed mirrors. Tall, broad-shouldered, but dressed in the uniform that separated him from the men who wore tailored suits and silk ties. He pressed the button for the top floor with a hand that was steadier than he expected. As the elevator rose, so did the weight in his chest. He had never spoken a single word to Regina Hollis. He had only seen her once in passing, a woman draped in black, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes that held the kind of wisdom only the ruthless possessed. Why him? What did she want? A sharp ding announced his arrival. The executive floor was silent, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and wealth. A woman sat at the front desk, typing with perfectly manicured nails. She barely glanced at him before gesturing toward the massive double doors at the end of the hallway. "He's waiting." Malcolm wiped his palms against his jumpsuit and made his way forward, feeling each step like a countdown to something he wasn't ready for. The doors loomed ahead, dark oak with brass handles that gleamed under the soft light. He raised a hand, hesitated, then knocked. "Enter." The voice was calm, composed, and yet it carried enough weight to push open the doors for him. Regina Hollis sat behind an enormous desk, her gaze fixed on the papers in front of her. She didn't look up right away, giving him just enough time to take in the room. Tall windows that overlooked the city, bookshelves lined with first editions, and a single painting on the wall that looked too expensive to be anything other than a masterpiece. When she finally raised her eyes, Malcolm straightened instinctively. "Mr. Carter." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." His legs obeyed before his mind caught up. He wasn't used to being told to sit in places like this. Usually he was the one cleaning the chairs after others left them. "I imagine you're wondering why you're here," she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. Malcolm nodded. He had no reason to play games. Regina studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning his face like she was reading something only she could see. Then, without warning, she slid a file across the desk toward him. "Open it." He hesitated, but did as she asked. Inside were pages upon pages of documents, contracts, and his heart nearly stopped. His name, printed in bold letters at the top of several forms. But his throat went dry as he flipped through them. "A proposition," Regina said smoothly, watching him closely. "One that could change your life." Malcolm's fingers clenched the edges of the papers. He didn't like surprises. He had spent too much of his life learning that unexpected things never worked in his favor. "You don't know me," he said carefully. Regina tilted her head slightly. I know more than you think." Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. "You've been with this company for 7 years," she continued. "You've never taken a sick day, never been late. You do your job quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. But what interests me most," she tapped a manicured finger on the desk, "is what you do when you think no one is watching." Malcolm stiffened. His mind raced through every moment he had spent in this building. What could she possibly be talking about? Regina's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. "The way you help the interns when they're lost. How you fix the broken vending machine even though it's not your job. The night you stayed late to clean up after the holiday party, alone, because you didn't want the overnight crew to deal with the mess." He swallowed hard. He didn't think anyone noticed those things. "Hey, pay attention, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "And I don't believe in wasted potential." Malcolm forced himself to breathe. "What do you want from me?" Regina leaned back in her chair, studying him like he was the final piece in a puzzle only she understood. "I want you to listen carefully, because I will only say this once." He gripped the folder tighter. "I want to offer you an opportunity," she said. "One that will take you far beyond this building, beyond mopping floors and scrubbing toilets. But before I do, I need to know one thing." Her gaze locked onto his, pinning him in place. "Are you the kind of man who lets circumstances define him, or are you the kind of man who changes them?" Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent his entire life believing that people like him didn't get offers like this, that no matter how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed, the world had already decided where he belonged. But as he sat there, staring into the eyes of a woman who had built empires with nothing but her name and her will, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, the world was wrong. Malcolm's fingers twitched against the folder in his lap. The weight of Regina Hollis's words settled into his bones, pressing against years of unspoken doubt, of knowing his place and never daring to step outside of it. But now, sitting across from a woman who saw something in him no one else had, he found himself standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. He cleared his throat, his voice measured. "What exactly are you offering me?" Regina didn't blink. "A chance to rewrite your story." Malcolm exhaled sharply through his nose. He'd spent years believing stories like his had only one ending: work hard, keep your head down, make enough to get by. His mother had always told him that the world didn't hand out second chances to men like them. It barely gave first ones. She reached into a sleek drawer and pulled out another folder, sliding it across the polished desk. "This is the company's newest acquisition, Westland Properties. It was my husband's last major investment before he passed." Her voice remained steady, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I want you to be a part of it." Malcolm stared at her, disbelief crawling up his spine. He was a janitor. She was asking him to step into a world where people wore suits that cost more than his annual rent. "You need someone to clean the offices." His words came out sharper than he intended. Regina's lips curved in the faintest smirk. "I need someone who understands work, who sees what others overlook. You think I haven't noticed how well you pay attention, how you move through this building knowing its pulse better than most of the executives upstairs?" She tapped her nails lightly against the desk. "You are not a janitor, Mr. Carter. You are someone who knows how to fix things." His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "What would I even do?" "Learn," she said simply. "Observe. Become more than what this building has told you you are." The words burned, not because they weren't true, but because they were. Malcolm had been here for years, listening to conversations he wasn't meant to hear, understanding how things worked without ever being invited to the table. He had studied people more than they had ever studied him. But stepping into this world, it felt impossible. Regina must have sensed his hesitation because she leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "I'll make it simple. Work under me, 6 months, no strings attached. If at the end of it you decide you'd rather go back to mopping floors, I won't stop you." Malcolm's jaw clenched. 6 months. 6 months to see if he could fit into a world that never once invited him in. He should say no. He should thank her for the offer and go back to the life he understood. But the word that left his mouth instead was, "Okay." Regina's smirk deepened, but she didn't gloat. She simply nodded, as if she had expected no other answer. "Good." She stood smoothly, an air of finality settling into the room. "You start tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp." Malcolm swallowed the lump in his throat. Tomorrow. And just like that, the meeting was over. He left her office feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted, like the very foundation of his world had been rewritten in the span of a single conversation. The elevator ride down felt different this time, as though the walls were pressing in, suffocating him with the weight of what he had just agreed to. The whispers in the lobby hit him the second he stepped out. What did she want with him? It looked serious. What if he's getting fired? Maybe he did something. They don't just call janitors up there. He ignored them, walking past the front desk without a word, his hands clenched into fists as he made his way outside, the crisp air biting at his skin. He needed time to think, but there was no time. Tomorrow, his life would change, whether he was ready for it or not. The next morning, Malcolm stood outside Regina's office door, his nerves a storm beneath his skin. He had ditched the jumpsuit in favor of the only decent button-up he owned, but he still felt out of place. His reflection in the glass showed a man who didn't belong in places like this. But he knocked anyway. "Come in." Regina was already at her desk, a steaming cup of coffee beside her. She barely looked up as he stepped inside. "Take a seat," she instructed. "We have a lot to cover." Malcolm sat stiffly, unsure of what to expect. She slid another file toward him. "I need you to familiarize yourself with this." He opened it hesitantly, scanning the neatly printed documents. Numbers, projections, client lists. Things that were entirely foreign to him. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to read this." Regina finally looked up. He swallowed. "You expect me to just... I expect you to understand that this is not about what you know today." She leaned back in her chair. "It's about what you are capable of knowing if given the chance." Malcolm's jaw tightened. She wasn't giving him an easy way out. "Start at the beginning," she continued. "Tell me what you see." He forced himself to focus. He wasn't an idiot. He knew how to learn. He had just never been given anything worth learning. Taking a slow breath, he let his eyes move over the documents. Some of the terms were unfamiliar, but he recognized patterns. Rows of figures. Recurring client names. "Westland Properties?" he murmured, his fingers tracing the heading on one of the pages. "It's a real estate firm." Regina gave a slight nod. "And?" He frowned, flipping through more pages. "There's a drop in revenue here, a big one." Her lips pressed together in approval. "Why?" He scanned the papers again, his eyes narrowing. "A lot of clients pulled out." His finger landed on a section of names that had canceled contracts. Something happened. "Keep going," she urged. His mind worked through it like a puzzle, each piece clicking into place. "They lost trust," he murmured. Something made them think it wasn't worth their money anymore. Regina's smirk returned. "Good." He looked up at her, confused. "Why does this matter?" "Because trust, Mr. Carter, is the most valuable currency in business. Lose it, and everything else crumbles." She tapped the paper in front of him. "Your job is to understand why they lost it, and then, if you're as good as I think you are, figure out how to get it back." Malcolm stared at her. "You're serious." "Deadly." His fingers tightened around the folder. He had expected this to be some kind of test, a way to humiliate him, to remind him that he didn't belong. But she wasn't setting him up to fail. She was expecting him to win. A slow fire burned in his chest, something unfamiliar but undeniable. He had spent his whole life cleaning up after men who made decisions in rooms like this. Maybe it was time he learned how to make them himself. "All right," he said finally, meeting her gaze. "Let's get to work." Regina's smile was small, but it was there. "Now you're starting to understand." Malcolm had never worked harder in his life. Days turned into weeks, and weeks blurred into months. Each morning he arrived earlier than the executives, poring over reports, watching meetings unfold from the corner of the room, absorbing every detail like his survival depended on it. Because in a way, it did. He knew he wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in the eyes of the men who looked at him with barely concealed confusion, the ones who couldn't understand why a janitor was suddenly sitting at the same table as them. But Malcolm didn't care about their doubts. He wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here to prove himself right. Regina never treated him like an outsider. She never spoke to him like he was beneath her. Nor did she make things easy. She drilled him with questions he wasn't prepared for, challenged him to think faster, smarter. She never allowed him to coast, not even for a second. "What's the problem with these numbers?" she asked one evening, sliding a report across her desk. Malcolm studied them, his brow furrowing. The revenue dip was familiar now, the client still hesitant to return, but something else was off. His fingers tapped against the page. "The investors," he muttered. "They're pulling back their commitments." Regina nodded slightly. "Why?" His mind worked quickly, sifting through everything he had learned. "Because they don't trust the leadership anymore." She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. And if they don't trust leadership, what happens? The company falls apart." Regina smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Exactly. It had taken Malcolm months to piece together the truth. The company wasn't just losing clients. It was rotting from the inside. Someone at the top had made bad decisions, gambled too recklessly, and now the entire foundation was crumbling. And Regina knew. "You saw this coming," he said slowly. She exhaled, tapping her fingers against the desk. "I did." "Then why haven't you done anything?" She held his gaze, the weight of her silence heavy between them. "Because, Malcolm," she said at last, "this company wasn't built for people like us." The word sent a shiver down his spine. People like us. He had spent his whole life being told where he belonged, and for the first time someone was saying it out loud. Not as a warning, but as a challenge. Malcolm straightened. "Then let's change that." Regina's smile returned, small but sharp. "That's what I wanted to hear." The next morning Malcolm walked into the boardroom for the first time. Not as an observer, not as a janitor, but as a man with something to say. The executives shifted in their seats, their expressions ranging from amusement to irritation. "What's he doing here?" one of them scoffed, looking toward Regina. Regina merely folded her hands in front of her. "He's here because I trust his judgment more than I trust any of yours." The room went silent. Malcolm took a breath. He had never spoken in front of men like this before, men who could crush careers with a single decision. But fear was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. "Westland is failing," he said, his voice steady. "Not because of the market, not because of outside forces, but because of greed." A few of them shifted uncomfortably. Others frowned. Malcolm continued, flipping open the reports he had prepared. "The investors don't trust leadership anymore. They see the internal instability, the reckless spending, the lack of accountability. And if you don't fix that, this company won't have a future." One of the men let out a short, bitter laugh. "And you think you have the answer?" "I know I do." Malcolm turned the page, revealing the figures he had spent weeks compiling. Westland doesn't need new clients. It needs to rebuild the trust of the ones it lost. That means transparency. That means proving that leadership isn't just lining their own pockets while everyone else drowns. Murmurs spread around the room, some skeptical, others intrigued, but no one dismissed him outright, not anymore. Regina watched him, her expression impassive, but Malcolm could see the approval in her eyes. One of the older executives, a man who had been with the company for decades, steepled his fingers. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "Start at the top. Audit every major decision that led to this point. Hold the people responsible accountable. Show your investors that this company still stands for something." Silence stretched across the room. Then, slowly, the older executive nodded. "He's right." The tide shifted. One by one, the others started to listen, to consider. And in that moment, Malcolm knew he wasn't just here to learn anymore. He was here to lead. By the end of the meeting, the decision had been made. The company would begin its internal audit. Leadership would be restructured. And Malcolm, the janitor who wasn't supposed to be here, had just changed the course of everything. As the board members filtered out, Regina stood, walking over to where he sat. "You did well," she said simply. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was intense?" Her lips twitched. "Get used to it." He exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. "You planned this, didn't you?" Regina's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I didn't plan anything, Malcolm. I simply put the right man in the right place." His chest tightened at the words. The right man. For the first time, he believed it. As he left the office that night, walking past the lobby where people still whispered about him, past the break rooms he had spent years cleaning, past the executives who no longer ignored him, Malcolm Carter realized something. He had walked into this building as a janitor, but he would walk out as something more. And for the first time in his life, he had no doubt that he belonged.